Hey there everyone, welcome back to Inky Dink Scrap with Leanne Wagner. Today we are looking at homemade embellishments for our scrapbook collections. So you'll remember that I did have different floral and flourish and wallpaper papers in my selection for my feminine collection. So what I'm going to show you today is embellishments that I've made for the feminine papers. I'm going to show you how you can create your own embellishments using stamps, inks and embossing folders. It's a fantastic way to add a personal touch to your own scrapbook projects and collections. Before we dive into the fun part, let's talk about materials. What do we actually need? So we need some stamps, and here's a few that I've used. If you haven't watched the first video, please do have a look at that about creating your own collection, because I share in there what the motives are of my base papers, which is why I've selected some of these stamps. So I've used a simplified flower. I've used some Vicky Bouton flowers and leaves. I've used some Kaiser Craft butterflies and some more Vicky Bouton flowers, leaves and honeycomb prints, and then also some paper rose flowers and also some Kaiser Craft stamps which incorporate a doily. So they're just some of the stamps that you'll see featured in the embellishments I've made. Next, you'll need some ink. And I used a huge range, and I'm not going to show you them all, but I've used distressed inks, I've used distressed Oxide inks, and then I've used some different dye inks from my collection, and you'll see more about that later. The other thing, of course, I've used is cardstock. Now with cardstock, for most of them, I've just used a 300 GSM white cardstock, which I've stamped on and inked up. And then also you need some basic tools. You're going to need some scissors. You're going to need a heat tool. You may need an embossing machine. I've got a Big Shot, so I use that. And you'll need glue, foam, tape, and some sort of heat resistant surface to work on. You will also need some dies. I guess you don't have to use dies, but it just makes it so much easier when you're cutting out your stamped images. So I've used some hearts from Uniquely Creative. I used this little banner die, the small sizes in this case. I found this flourish also from Uniquely Creative. I used this gorgeous, it's like chook wire really, from Studio Light. And also some swirly embellishments from Kaiser Craft. And this tiny little one, which is a Couture Creations die. And the last one is from Elizabeth Craft Designs, these lovely little butterflies. The embossing folders that I've used, I used a Tim Holtz Sizzix 3D Impresslet butterfly. This is just gorgeous. If you can still find those around the place, grab yourself one. It's fabulous. I also used some swirly embossing folders. This one's from Craft Concepts. It's very flourishy with leaves called Budding Vine. I have this one, Tri-Boss with butterflies. This one is also quite, how would you say, flamboyant with flourishes and stylized flowers and leaves. That's a Reese embossing folder, and this one is by Claire Coxon, which is a lovely frame. So let's have a look at some ones where I've used a lot of stamping and inking. You can see I've made some floral clusters, and if you remember from last time when I was discussing the collection for the feminine papers, I was talking about incorporating some mulberries and pinks, and I have actually done that. So put a little bit of yellow in them as well. So when we're stamping images and making clusters and embellishments, When we're inking, the simplest way to think about it is to use a base color. So in my case, I've gone with a black ink because then it allows me to add color to the images without too much contrast. It works really beautifully also using just a simple light gray ink or a simple sepia brown ink. It depends on what sort of look you're going for. For me, I wanted it to be slightly more striking, and especially because I was putting in hints of the mulberry, the pink, magenta, and the yellow. Step 1 is stamping. Select a stamp that matches your papers or your project theme. I've gone with this butterfly. Ink your stamp up in your selected colour. I'm using Archival ink and this is black soot. Position your stamp carefully on your cardstock where you want it to go and gently push down to transfer the design. And repeat the process. One of the best things to do when you're stamping and making your own embellishments is to batch the process. So when we're doing that, we're talking about creating multiple images using one stamp to start with. I always like to heat dry my images before I colour them. It's not always necessary, it depends on your cardstock. It's just an extra guarantee to stop any smudging from occurring should the ink still be wet. You have a couple of options when it comes to colouring your stamped images. I love to use Distress Oxide ink. Tim Holtz's straight distress ink is great as well, but also really any dye ink works perfectly fine. You can add your colour before you cut them out or after. I try to be heavy in part of the image, but not all of it. See how we can get different tones just by how much ink we apply. This one needs a bit more here. There we go. Don't forget to heat dry them, especially if you're using the Oxide inks. And it's simply a case of fussy cutting out your images. When you're making embellishments, you want to think about colour, layers and texture, which is why we use embossing folders. So you can see here that I've die cut some flowers and I've also embossed them through a embossing folder. It just adds that extra texture and makes it more interesting when you layer the flowers and images together. When using embossing folders, I find that it's a good idea to dampen your cardstock first with a spray of water. It just gives you a crisper image. Simply place your cardstock within your folder and run it through your die cut machine. Make sure you leave it to dry before you colour it with your ink. After that, it's just a simple matter of layering them together using foam tape, double-sided tape and glue. Some final touches, maybe some string. Of course, you can substitute ribbon if you prefer. Simple combination of stamps, inks, embossing folders opens up a world of creative possibilities. Feel free to experiment with different designs and colours and themes to match your projects and your own collections. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to get notifications so you don't miss out on any of my tutorials. My next video will be using these embellishments on scrapbook layouts. Here you can see where I've used the gorgeous Sizzix 3D Impresslet butterfly. It really comes to life when you rub on a little bit of ink. In this tag you can see that I've distressed some areas, and I've also stained the cardstock with some distress Oxide ink. Size is also important when you're making embellishments. So here I've got a much larger piece. This will be a beautiful corner piece on a scrapbook layout. I've stamped and inked a frame just on white cardstock. The whole thing is made with white cardstock. All the images have been stamped and coloured up with dye inks and with distressed Oxide inks. And you can see here I've die cut this lovely butterfly and layered it on top of a stamped butterfly image. Just adds some interesting texture. You can also incorporate some chipboard. So this piece was actually a light pink colour, and I've dyed it and then I've gone and stamped it over the top with this very interesting dotty stamp here from Uniquely Creative. By doing it in monotones, it adds some texture without making the stamped image too defined. Sometimes a little hint of colour is all you need to make something pop further. So I've got this green butterfly, a bit unusual for a butterfly, but it works beautifully with the papers. And then I've just put this pop of magenta pink and a light blue behind it with some circular punches. Thanks for joining me today.